So as Paul said, in late 2019, we commemorated Sydney Airport's centenary. We are one of the oldest operating airports in the world, or continuously operating airports in the world. So we turn 102 in a matter of weeks. Though, as you'll see in a moment, the first flight on the site of today's airport actually took place somewhat earlier in 1911 from what was then called the Ascot Racecourse. So the history of aviation at that site has gone right back to 1911, which, as you know, is only a few years after the Wright brothers and only 17 years after Lawrence Hargrave. So there's been an aviation presence in that part of Sydney for pretty much the entire history of global aviation, which is pretty remarkable. This evening, I'll take you through a potted history from 1911 to the present day, and then touch on the future, which is quite interesting at the moment, obviously. So far as the present's concerned, of course, it's all about the impact of COVID-19, but we are coming out of that, as I'll show. So this is the first flight, 18th of April, 1911. This picture was taken, front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. New Zealand aviator Joseph Joe Hammond became the first person to fly from the site that became today's Sydney Airport. It was then the Ascot Racecourse, and you can see the grandstand in the background there. Photographer from the Herald was there and captured the moment, the very first flight at the airport. As I said, only 17 years after Lawrence Hargrave took to the sky, not that far to the south of the airport, down at Stanwell Tops, probably only about 35 kilometres away. And only 8 years actually after the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk in the US. Hammond was from New Zealand, and his school in Wellington reported that, and I quote, "He never knew what fear was. He had a passionate love for any vocation that held the promise of excitement and danger. His early exploits on horseback earned him the nickname Daredevil Joe." So he was kind of almost born to be an aviator. So it was destiny. I think he became an expert aviator at the age of 23, having learned to fly in just 10 days. Very interesting character. He'd also been a gold prospector in the Klondike, a trapper in Alaska, and a cowboy in Buffalo Bill's circus. So he got around. He would fly 17 more times in Sydney, each time witnessed by thousands of enthralled Sydney-siders who each paid half a crown for the privilege. This is a closer view of Hammond's biplane. It was made of light wood, Egyptian cotton, and was held together by paste and piano wire. It had a wingspan of just over 10 metres and weighed in at a mere 500 kilograms. The first flight attained a height of only 40 metres and lasted less than 10 minutes. So today, you compare that to an A380 flying from Sydney Airport, made of high-strength, lightweight materials, weighs about 560 tonnes, has a wingspan of 80 metres, a range of 15,400 kilometres, and can seat around 500 passengers. And in flight, it will attain a height of around 12 kilometres. It's always amazed me that aviation has gone from what we see in the picture here to an A380 in just over 100 years. Quite extraordinary. Now, like many pioneer aviators, Hammond flew during the Great War. He served with the Royal Flying Corps, including at the front in France in 1914. He would rise to the rank of captain. He became a test pilot, and while flying in the United States in support of a war bomb drive, he tragically died only weeks before the end of the war on the 22nd of September 1918, when his plane crashed coming into land. Now, at Sydney Airport, as Paul would know, we're very keen, and I'm certainly keen, to always celebrate our history. The people who work at the airport are thrilled to know the history of the airport. It really excites the team. So back in 1911, or sorry, the 18th of April 2011, which was the 100th anniversary of that first flight, we commemorated that. We engaged two actors, the two on the right, and I had great fun finding a Model T Ford and a driver to reenact Hammond arriving at the airport. For those with long memories like me, you might remember the Auntie Jack program on the ABC. The actor in the middle we engaged to play Hammond, his name's John Derham, and he was one of the Auntie Jack actors back in the late 60s and early 70s. And that was a great fun. Now, turning next to who I believe to be the most important person in Sydney Airport's history, and unfortunately one of our least known. That's something I'm trying to rectify, and that's our founder, Nigel Love. And you can see a picture of Nigel here. It's a shame that few people have heard of Nigel, but given his preeminent role in founding Sydney Airport, as well as his many other aviation achievements, which I'll mention in a moment, we've done our best to make sure people know who Nigel was and what he did. Now, I think he was, in many respects, Australia's greatest aviator, as I think you'll see. We've named our main office building at the airport after Nigel, the Nigel Love Building, and a bridge over the Alexandra Canal is the Nigel Love Bridge. You might notice if you're driving along next to the airport. Now, like Hammond, Nigel Love, who's in the middle of this photograph, flew during the war, the Great War. He flew in 3 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps, and saw active service in various theatres, including above the Somme battlefield. There he faced up against the German ace, the Baron von Richthofen, better known, of course, as the Red Baron. One of Nigel's tasks was to map enemy trenches from above, flying slowly at low altitude and draw the position of trenches in a notebook that he had balanced on his lap. A notebook that still exists to this day, and I've seen it at the home of Nigel's son, John. It is a quite remarkable document. The detail in the diagrams of the trenches is quite extraordinary. Now, when you consider the fact the enemy would have been firing up at him from below, you get an idea of just how courageous Nigel and these other wartime aviators were at the time. And their life expectancy, I've heard John say, was measured in weeks. So incredibly dangerous. So, and there's an entry in Nigel's diary, which again is quite remarkable. 21st of April 19, he records in his diary that they believed they had shot down the Red Baron's plane over Australian lines. And in fact, that was confirmed. So there was some controversy about who shot down Richthofen, and it appears to be quite genuinely, it was Australians who shot him down. But such was the respect for the Baron, and between the two sides, they gave him a full military funeral. And Nigel was present at that funeral. So after the war, Nigel returned from the battlefields of Western Europe in 1919, and he selected a bullock paddock near Cook's River in Mascot, on which his company, the Australian Aircraft and Engineering Company, would assemble and fly the Avro 504K aircraft. The site was recommended to him by Rain and Horn real estate agent in the city. And you can see Nigel's hangar here circled in green in relation to today's airport. The site would have been pretty much at the end of the passenger pier at T2, if you know Sydney Airport's Terminal 2. The Ascot Racecourse is out of shot to the left of the photo. And in the distance, you can see market gardens and the like. One of those areas of market gardens exists to this day off in towards Bexley. So that bullock paddock became today's Sydney Airport. You can see the Cooks River up in the top there. That's the original location of the Cooks River. It originally flowed through the middle of the airport. The river had to be moved in the 1950s to reconfigure the runways to their present north-south and east-west direction. So I'm sure that could never happen today, to actually move a river. In fact, only up until a few years ago, when the old Rockdale City and City of Botany Bay councils were amalgamated to form the Bayside Council, you could see the presence of the former river across the airport, because it was the old local government boundary between the two former councils, snaking through the airport like an S in the middle of the airport. Here you can see a closer view of both the hangar and the Avro 504K aircraft that were being manufactured in nearby Mascot, then transported to the on-airport hangar to be assembled on site. And of course, I'm sure many of you would have seen the replica Avro 504K on the departure level of the Qantas T3 terminal here at Sydney. As Managing Director and Chief Test Pilot, Nigel Love then flew the first flight carrying the new airport's very first passenger, Mr. Billy Marshall. I'll return to Mr. Marshall later in the presentation. So April 1920, Nigel also flew the first commercial flight, passenger flight from Sydney to Melbourne. Pre-COVID, that was the second busiest air route in the world. Nigel Love's company also supplied Qantas with its very first passenger commercial aircraft. So as I said, the achievements of Nigel, so many firsts, so many important firsts, make him an incredibly important character. Here you can see the Avro in flight high above the airport and see Botany Bay in the background. So those firsts just emphasised how important a figure he was in Australia's aviation history. Paul mentioned earlier about the engine of the aircraft that's being restored. That's very relevant here because Nigel also built the first aircraft for who became the RAAF. And you can see here the aircraft coming off the production line. This was the first of the RAAF's Avro aircraft. It's commissioned in 1921. We had hoped to celebrate the centenary of that important historical achievement back in June, but unfortunately the border closures in June beat us to it by a matter of weeks. I'm hopeful we can do something, excuse me, to recognise that in the future. But there you have the first RAAF aircraft. Now, if you can forgive me just for a moment of self-indulgence, one reason I have a deep interest in aviation history is to do with my uncle Christopher Dole, you can see pictured here. Pictured with his Spitfire, he flew for 5.5 years with the RAF during the Second World War, including during the Battle of Britain. He was nicknamed the singing pilot because of his amazing baritone voice, which I can still hear in my ears to this day, and was known to have said, quote, "I've always been very lucky." An understatement when you consider the fact he was actually shot down twice and had to bail out 3 times, including over the Channel. So he was incredibly lucky to survive the full 5.5 years of the Second World War, flying Spitfires and other times Hurricanes. Now, turning to other great Australian aviation pioneers who were linked to Sydney Airport, as I'm sure everyone here knows, flying the Southern Cross with Co-Commander Charles Ulm, navigator Harry Lyon and radio operator Jim Warner, Charles Kingsford Smith completed the world's first trans-Pacific flight from the United States to Australia in 1928, landing first in Brisbane and then flying on to Sydney. The largest crowd of Sydney-siders then ever gathered, 300,000 out of a population of 1.2 million, was at the airport to greet them. So that's a quarter of Sydney's population. Today, that would be about 1.5 million people. So it gives you an idea of just how many Sydney-siders actually went to the airport to see Smithy and the crew return to Sydney. Also with Ulm, of course, he flew a record-breaking circumnavigation of Australia in 1927. And he also played a significant role in Sydney Airport's history, both as a pilot and joint founder with Ulm of Australian National Airways Limited in December 1928. Now, one of Kingsford Smith's flying jackets we have had restored. He's on loan from the Liverpool and District Historical Society. I had a call in, I think it was early 2018, from the society, and they basically said, look, we've got this old Charles Kingsford Smith jacket. Do you want it? And of course, the answer was yes. The condition, of course, was we had to have it restored and put it on display. So we've done both. It's now on display in our main office building called the Nigel Love Building at Sydney Airport. And you can see the jacket here, and it may well be the one that was worn on that first Trans-Pacific flight. We can confirm it is genuine. It is a Charles Kingsford Smith jacket. Standing on either side, you can see our Chief Executive, Jeff Colbert. And then the other is Smithy's grand-nephew, Leofray Kingsford Smith. And next to him is the federal member for Kingsford Smith, Matt Thistlethwaite. So that was a great thing to do. I'm hopeful we can put that on display in the T1 terminal so it can be seen by more and more people, because it's a very significant aviation artefact. As I said, we like to celebrate our history and our heritage at the airport, particularly those great aviation pioneers. And this is another example. June 2019, as I said, we named our main building the Nigel Love Building, which is in the International Terminal Precinct. We also named what was the old Customs House, which is another building in that terminal precinct, after Charles Ulm. So it was a great ceremony, an honour to have the Love and the Ulm families, as well as the Kingsford Smith families and Nancy Bird Walton's daughter. We had the descendant of Billy Marshall, the first passenger. And we had them all in the one room, which was just fantastic, a very special occasion. There were 4 generations of the Love family and the Ulm family there, which was amazing. Top photo, you can see John Love, his second from the right there, and he's Nigel's son. And the bottom photo, you can see Charles Ulm, who's the grandson of Charles Ulm, and an uncanny resemblance, I think you'll agree. with the Ulm building plaque. We were joined then by the then Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, and again, our local MP for Kingsford Smith, Matt Thistlethwaite. Another significant event also occurred in early 1920. That was the arrival of Ross and Keith Smith in their twin-engine Vickers Vimy. They'd just flown from England, picking up a £10,000 prize, which is a huge amount of money in those days, offered by Australian PM Billy Hughes. And to win, they had to do so in less than 30 days. They made it, landing on the 12th of November 1919 in Darwin after 28 days. So they just made it on this 10th of December 1919. The original plan was to complete the journey by flying direct to Melbourne. But having none of that, Nigel Love, then based at Sydney Airport and just opened the airport, lobbied New South Wales Premier to get them to fly to Sydney first and then on to Melbourne. And he succeeded in that. So you can see them landing here on the 14th of February, 1920. And when our new parallel north-south runway opened in 1994, a Vickers Vimy aircraft replica was the first aircraft to land on that runway. Fast forward to 1933, and here we see the great Nancy Bird Walton at Sydney Airport's Kingsford Smith Flying School. Now, of course, Nancy has been appropriately and well honoured by having the new Western Sydney Airport named after her, which is great to see. When she was awarded a commercial pilot's licence at the age of 19, Nancy bought her first aircraft, a de Havilland Gypsy Moth, and like the one shown here. Soon after, she took off on a barnstorming tour, dropping in on country fairs, giving joyrides for people who've never seen aircraft, let alone a female pilot. And while touring, Bird met Reverend Stanley Drummond, and he wanted her to help set up a flying medical service in outback New South Wales. So in 1935, she was hired to operate that service, and her own Gypsy Moth was used as an air ambulance. Soon after the Second World War broke out, she began training women in skills needed to back up the men flying in the RAAF. Now, I often say at the airport, Sydney Airport is in many ways implicated in a lot of the most iconic events in Australian history. You see one of them here. I'm sure people would recognise the photograph. It's one of the more iconic photographs taken at the airport. This was back in 1954. The height of the Cold War and the so-called Petrov affair, of course. And here we see armed KGB agents escorting the wife of then third secretary of the Soviet embassy in Canberra and then defector to the west to an aircraft to fly her back to the Soviet Union, where she would have no doubt faced a grim future. Luckily, ASIO managed to seize her from the KGB when the plane landed in Darwin by saying it was illegal to carry arms on an aircraft. So she and husband Vladimir Petrov was subsequently offered asylum in Australia, which they, of course, accepted. Another iconic image, that's Louis Armstrong, or Satchmo. He arrived in Sydney Airport in 1956 to a welcome from the Sydney Jazz Club, and of course he serenaded the crowd on his arrival. Another iconic image, this photograph was taken about 3 weeks after I was born, 11th of June 1964. Thousands of screaming fans huddled in the pouring rain to greet the Beatles. The platform on which they stood is still there. You can see it. It's adjacent to what was our first control tower, in between the T2 and T3 terminals. Now, interestingly, one Beatle was missing. The observant amongst you may be thinking, who's the person on the right under the umbrella? There are 3 others, George, Paul, and John, who's obscured on the left. The man on the right, his name's Jimmy Nicol, and he was standing in for Ringo, who had been hospitalised in London with a sore throat. He was to join them on the tour later on. Now 81, there's a very sad photo of Jimmy Nicol leaving Australia a week later, sitting alone in the terminal departure lounge, and you can see that photo here. Somewhat quite a departure compared to when he had arrived a week before. Many years later, he said, standing in for Ringo was the worst thing that ever happened to him. He went to the peak of fame to a deep trough of not being recognised. Then we entered the age of supersonic aircrafts, and also an age when people could wander on the tarmac and willy-nilly to look at an aircraft close up. The only supersonic aircraft to enter wide commercial service was, of course, the Anglo-French Concorde, which first arrived at Sydney Airport in 1972. Qantas taking out options on the purchase of the aircraft, the pressure was on for Sydney Airport to cater for its operations. This included an extension of our main runway into Botany Bay, which you can see in the distance there, lengthening the runway to almost 2.5 kilometres. The extended runway opened in 1968. Now, of course, for noise-related reasons, the Concorde was never to fly to Australia regularly. Simultaneously, the government announced in '65 that it would build a new international terminal on the then unused western side of the airport site. That new terminal was opened by the Queen in 1970, meaning T1 turned 50 years last year. Again, we were unable to celebrate that achievement because of COVID. But there you can see the international terminal. So we extended the runway to make way for an aircraft that ended up never flying to Sydney in any appreciable numbers. But of course, it could take 747s and the like, and A380s today. So you all recognise Sydney Airport today, very distinctive runway layout. The shape of the runway is the cruciform shape you can see there is actually heritage listed because of its distinctive, well, it just screams Sydney Airport. People who see that can see Sydney Airport. As I said, main runway was lengthened in the 60s to 2,440 metres, 2.5 kilometres. Its current length is just under 4 kilometres. That makes it one of the longest runways, certainly in the Southern Hemisphere, and almost certainly one of the longest in the world. In contrast, the east-west runway, which you can see the cross runway there, and the parallel north-south runway on the right are only about 2.5 kilometres in length. Now, the airport's also relatively small, 907 hectares, and that includes the areas reclaimed from Botany Bay. I say small because Brisbane is 2,700 hectares, Melbourne 2,600, Perth 2,100, and Western Sydney Airport is 1,800 hectares. So we're pretty small in terms of area. Now, like all airports, Sydney Airport makes a significant contribution to the local economy, and through the global pandemic, that's unfortunately reduced the contribution. But in 2019, the airport generated or provided $42 billion in economic activity and supported the direct and indirect employment of 340,000 people. That's equivalent to 10% of New South Wales employment and included 33,000 direct jobs on the airport site. So the airport is a huge, as all airports are, huge economic generators. We were proud in 2007, October, to welcome the world's first ever commercial A380 service. This was actually the first week I arrived when this happened. We had several hundred aviation journalists from around the world out on a rather wet and windy airfield to witness the event. As I mentioned earlier, when you compare this aircraft to what Joe Hammond was flying just over 100 years earlier, it's pretty remarkable. Aviation activity forecasting undertaken as part of our master planning process is actually assuming that there will be fewer A380s flying in the future. That's because, well, a few things. First of all, they have 4 engines. They use a lot of fuel compared to twin engine aircraft. Fuel, of course, is a huge expense for airlines. And also with so many passengers, 500 plus, the belly hold is full of bags, as you'd expect. That leaves very little room for air freight. And it's air freight that often makes the commercial difference for a particular flight being viable or not. So A380s, ironically, are probably too big. So airlines now, as we've seen with Qantas, going back to 787s and A350s and the like there. 2019, we had 44.4 million passengers, 350,000 flights, so close to 1,000 a day. In September 2019, just before COVID, we actually welcomed our 1 billionth passenger. I went back through all the records, and as close as I could get it to, we determined that the 1 billionth passenger would pass through the T1 terminal on the 5th of September 2019. So that was a big event on that day. And a passenger was designated a young 12-year-old girl who had a great time because she was passenger 1 billion, and Singapore Airlines gave them some free flights and the like, which was great. You can also see this photo demonstrates very clearly why Sydney Airport is such an economic engine, and that is in major part, because of its proximity to the Sydney CBD, only 5.5 kilometres. That brings with it, of course, noise-related issues, because there's a lot of people live in that area. So noise has always been and always will be an issue at the airport. So that takes us to 2020 and into this year. The last 18 months, the impact, of course, has been severe on aviation and airports and airlines. We estimate in recent months we were down to 1% of 2019 passenger numbers. Now, those numbers have not been seen since 1960. My rough calculation, the number of flights we saw at the depth of COVID was equivalent to somewhere in the 1950s. So that gives you an idea of just the depth of the downturn. Nevertheless, we had to keep the airport operating day to day, 24/7, to accommodate repatriation flights, freight and other flights, even though the financial loss to the company was significant in doing so. Our charges for airlines are based on per passenger. So we had flights coming in, like A350 aircraft that would have 2 passengers on them, and the rest of the plane would be full of freight. So we would get paid by that airline about $42, yet the plane would cost us about $10,000 to service. So we were losing money hand over fist for that 18 months. Interesting phenomenon we saw last year and into this year, we had all sorts of unusual aircraft flying into Sydney. This, of course, is the Antonov. Ironically, today we welcome 2 more of these Antonovs flying into Sydney. Last year, they were bringing firefighting helicopters for the Royal Fire Service, and I'm pretty sure that's what they were doing today, delivering helicopters for the RFS. We also saw a Mongolian airline, which was unusual, and African airlines we'd never seen in Sydney before. That's because airlines were deploying all sorts of aircraft to keep freight moving. E-commerce freight in particular has gone gangbusters. It was going up significantly before COVID and has gone up exponentially since. So one thing COVID has done is really put a rocket under the air freight market, which is good. So few flights in the air, airlines had to park their aircraft, of course. A lot of them took them to Mojave Desert in the United States. Here in Sydney, we temporarily closed our east-west runway to park grounded aircraft, and you can see some of them here. Quite remarkable to see planes stacked up in that way. Another phenomenon we've seen is, because airlines are looking to save and cut costs, be as efficient as possible, the shift to the quiet next generation aircraft like the 787 and A350 appears to have been accelerated. These aircraft are incredibly fuel efficient compared to the 747s. So airlines are really putting these into service. That's not just good news for fuel efficiency and lower emissions. These aircraft are significantly quieter than the other aircraft. So that's a very positive phenomenon for our local community. Now, the fact the airport's opening up again is good. This gives you an idea of just the value of international aviation to the economy. $100 billion a year, 515,000 jobs across Australia. Freight is 34 billion of that, so about a third. Holidays, tourism is only 13 billion. That's a lot of money, but it's not as much as you might think. The big number there you can see is education. $40 billion generated for the economy from international students and their visiting friends and relatives coming into Australia. So the sooner we can get international students back into our universities, those numbers will start recovering. I'll end on an optimistic note. As of this Monday, we started opening up again when the state government removed the need for 2 weeks quarantine for inbound passengers and also allowed Australians to leave the country without permission. Our prediction is optimistic, and I'll quote from our media release, the recovery is expected to reach 16% of pre-COVID international seat capacity by the end of this month, increasing to nearly 40% in January 22. Domestic seat capacity is expected to grow from 25% of pre-COVID this month to 89% in January 22. So you can see the recovery, quite rapid. The pent-up demand to travel is extraordinary. We saw that when we briefly opened up from about March to mid-June this year. So we're expecting that the number of flights is going to increase quickly and significantly. And I would hope that within 2 years, or perhaps sooner, we'll be back to 2019 levels and growing again. And these last 2 images, very emotional day on Monday, with a lot of the returning Australians coming in. And of course, it was a media frenzy, as you'd expect. So I'll leave it there. I'm very happy to answer questions, I should say. I'll stop sharing.
It's Warwick Bigsworth here. I'm wondering about the what your projected impact is on the opening of the Western Sydney Airport in 2025 or 26.
This is our master plan. As you said, Western Sydney Airport opens in they say they're on schedule to open in December 24, 2026. I'll show you that's, I don't know if you can see that the passenger forecast, but you can see the dip in passengers in 2026. So that there will be a shift of passengers from Kingsford Smith to Western Sydney, but Kingsford Smith will then start growing again, albeit at a slightly slower rate. And there's a similar pattern for flight numbers. That's the equivalent diagram for freight. You can see again the dip there. Western Sydney Airport, it's approved at the moment to go to 10 million passengers, I think by 2030. So they'll need approvals to go beyond that. But we'd anticipate, say by 2070, thereabouts, you're going to have two airports about the same size on either end of Sydney, much like Tokyo, I guess, with the two airports there. So Western Sydney will be a great success. There's no doubt about that. There's huge population and economic activity in Western Sydney. So it's long overdue they're getting that airport. So that's very good news for the people of Western Sydney.
Yep. Hi, Ted. Dennis Smith. Just a little bit of trivia. I was at the cinema last week at Roseville, one of the Sydney suburban news, and ran into John Om, the son of Charles, and he had his son. He had his son there as well. He's just turned 100.
I know.
And he was
out and about, was he? That's great.
Yeah, he's gone to the cinema. He's had a bit of one of those zinger things to push himself along, but he was living only about 2 streets from me in Greenwich, which we moved out just recently.
About 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But he's moved, has he?
Yeah, no, I moved.
Oh, you moved, yeah.
Yeah.
He's a remarkable character.
Yeah. Well, he knew Paul Brickhill quite well.
Oh, really?
The war. Yeah, because he was flying Spitfires, got shot down himself.
That's right, he was too, yeah.
Anyway, it was just interesting to see that. Well, I wasn't sure if he was still alive. He would be only one of about 3 Spitfire pilots from the Second World War still alive, I think.
My uncle died 15 years ago. Not that many. No, John is a remarkable character because he was a journalist and wrote for The Sun for a while as well.
Yes, well, that's why he had an interest with Paul Brickhill, because his personal friend living just down the road from him in Greenwich was Peter Finch, the actor.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, they both went to North Sydney Boys High School together, and then it was Peter Finch, I think, that talked him into going into the newspapers as copy boy, before the war,
And Charles, his son, it's a remarkable resemblance with Charles Ulm.
Yes.
You'd sort of shake your head when you speak.
Anyway, thanks for great talk. It's interesting. One very quick question, that the Western Airport, how are they going to select which destinations are going to be flying in and out of that? Because living in close to the Sydney Airport, I'm only 20 minutes away maximum. What's going to happen if the flight I want to go to is flying out of bloody Western Creek at Eastern Creek?
It's a good question. I raise that with our people, and what they say is it's market driven. So an airline won't fly to or from Western Sydney Airport unless they can make a quid. So the early destinations, I think you'll find that there'll be a lot of domestic traffic: Sydney, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Sydney, Ballina, and things like that, and probably international destinations like Fiji and maybe Southeast Asia. But I don't think you're going to get flights out there that wouldn't fly from Sydney.
Hopefully.
So, but as I said, there's a lot of people live out there, and for them to get to Kingsford Smith, particularly if traffic's a problem, it can take them hours. So the fact they'll have an airport on their doorstep is a good thing.
As long as they don't take it away from ours.
No, the airlines will choose to fly from either airport or both. I guess the one advantage they've got over us, and I'm not using this to question our curfew, but they haven't got a curfew, whereas we do, of course. So they may well be able to attract airlines to that airport that can't fly to Kingston Smith because of our curfew. Like Melbourne has got a number of flights that are around between midnight and 1 a.m. and things like that. So they may get those.
Yeah, Kathy asked a question just a while ago. Was it intended that Western Sydney would be more freight than passengers?
No, I mean, they will be a strong freight airport, as we are. The reason I say that is 80% of air freight is actually carried in passenger aircraft, only 20% in dedicated freighters. So while ever Sydney has got so many passenger aircraft, we're going to have a lot of air freight coming in those planes. That said, Western Sydney, I think they're going out to tender now for construction of a large cargo precinct. So that will be a very strong focus for them, which is good. But I don't think it will dilute Sydney Airport's role in the freight industry, particularly that e-commerce freight coming in, which, as I said, is growing very strongly.
There's another airline apparently going to come onto the market, Bonza Airlines. What would be the gate sort of situation? Would you have capacity at a gate, or would it be walk on, walk off the tarmac? Are there some plans to accommodate them at Sydney, or is it early days?
Yeah, I've not heard of them, but it depends when they want to arrive. We're because you probably know we're capped at 80 flights an hour. In our peak, well, in 2019, in our peak, slots in the peak were very hard to get. So if they wanted to arrive at a time when there were no slots available, that would be a problem. But there's lots of spare capacity during the day, for instance. And if low-cost airlines particularly, they're not that necessarily sensitive to having arrived. Like a lot of the full-service airlines arrive just after 6 a.m. to say 6 to 8 a.m. A low-cost carrier is quite comfortable flying in at, I'd say, arriving at 11 a.m. because they can leave their home port at 3 a.m. That's why they're low cost. And then they get the passengers off, get the new ones on, and they depart at 1 p.m. So the turnaround time is pretty quick. So it really depends when they want to fly into Sydney.
Thank you.
Ted, it's John Booth here. Ted, is it possible to look at the very early black and white aerial shot again of Ascot Racecourse with the...
Yeah.
I just want a bit, if you could point out a bit of the geography and which way is north and south and stuff, just for orientation for me. Thanks, mate.
I'll just get it back on.
Is that Botany Bay to the...
That's Botany Bay up there.
Okay, so that's south, yeah.
So that's what is today's General Holmes Drive.
Yes.
Going along there. Our main runway now sort of goes out that direction.
Yeah.
T2, the terminal T2 is here.
Yes.
The racecourse is kind of just off to the left there.
Okay.
And this is the so-called bullet paddock.
Okay. Now that Cook River, is that now the river that goes north of the international terminal? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was moved over that direction.
So on the left of the picture,
yeah,
where the Cook River exits the picture, is that where the Cook River goes out to the bay?
No, the Cook River now goes out to the bay about there.
Oh, okay. Where did it originally go out to the bay?
Just to the left here, near.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay.
Near Port Botany today.
All right, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
It's Warwick Henry. Can I mention? Get the picture there.
Oh, you want me to get it back on?
I was just going to point out the railway line.
Oh, yes, there is a railway line. Right. Yeah.
Down the bottom left, they're running left, right. Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And at one stage, a runway crossed the railway line. And at one stage, this is we had a bingle with a train.
We still have a railway line.
Detoured the railway line and made more space available on the ground on the southern side of the railway line.
Why was all of that area still available for an airport? Was it flood prone? You couldn't have suburbs on it?
Yeah, I've not thought about that, but I suspect that's right. It was the delta for the Cooks River. So it would have been quite marshy. The water table, even to this day, is only like 2 meters below the surface. So I suspect it was, like a mosquito-ridden swamp, basically, not for habitable housing. I know there were night soil disposal areas there and all sorts of things, as I said, market gardens. So it was just never developed for housing, whereas what became the suburb of Mascot just to the east certainly was. So yeah, so I suspect the land was just not seen as suitable for housing, but was for, well, grazing cattle in the first instance, and then as an airport.
Of course, Sydney was so much smaller in those days, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
A lot of land around available in those days.
I think just to add to the point, the area was quite contaminated in the, I believe from what history I know, mid-late 19th century, early 20th.
Yeah.
There was a leather tanning works down there, and a sewage pumping station. Some of you may have seen the large concrete sort of storm channels and effluent towers and everything. And I think that's the marshes there were poorly drained and not suitable for any form of residential living even then.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. The tannery, I think there was more than one. There were lots of tanneries in the old Botany industrial area, and they used a chemicals called chromates,
Yep.
which are very toxic. And the water, one of the aquifers there is contaminated to this day with chromium contamination. So that's a legacy from the 19th and early 20th century.
Now, if I may, just a bit of a personal side to the airport. Dr. Bill Bradfield was very instrumental in the development of
very much so.
the airport after the war. And he told me that where the international terminal is was originally a rubbish dump which attracted birds. And of course, birds and aircraft don't go all that well together. So he arranged with the local gas works to have all the coke dumped on the site so as to obliterate the tip and get rid of the birds. So that's a nice sort of a personal, good field story about the airport.
Yeah, no, you're correct. There were rubbish dumps around the place, attracting thousands of seagulls.
Ted, are there any proposals to produce sort of a centenary book as per the 80th anniversary book? Do you know?
There wasn't at the time, so that ship may well have sailed.
Right, yeah.
I think our people did look into it, but it was decided not to. But you're right, we did one in 80 and 85, I think.
Yes, and then there was that other one from Bullocks to...
Yeah, Boeing's, yeah.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, I can't get the movie up, unfortunately, but if you Google GEO, G-U-I-L-L-A-U-X, and it's the first video that comes up, and it's got a picture of the crash of his aircraft on August the 2nd, 1914, and a picture of him taking off on the race course. And I often wondered whether it was accurate or not, but I recognised the buildings that you saw in the Hammond picture. So if you just Google GEO and get the first video, it's there. G-U-I-L-L-A-U-X. G-U-I-L-L-A-U-X.
Okay, I'll do that. Excellent.
And but there's only about 15 seconds of movie on Ascot Racecourse, but I do think it might be the first movie taken in the area.
Oh, would have been for sure.
The airport is in the process of being taken over by other operators or another operator. Is there any change in or do you believe there will be any change in the strategy for the future development of the airport as a result of that takeover?
Yeah, first of all, there's been no decision that the offer's in, but yeah, our board's not made a final decision yet. I think it will happen, well, I don't know, soon. But no, I mean, we're being told that we wouldn't expect there to be any significant change. We only listed on the stock exchange, and I think we're the only airport in Australia listed on the stock exchange. That only happened, I think, in 2013. So up until then, we were owned by various super funds and the like. So if the takeover succeeds, we'll just go back to what it was like pre-2013. I wouldn't expect there to be a significant change.
I'm not up to speed with the latest master plan, but in previous master plans not too long ago, there was proposed changes to T1, whereas to be more of a linear terminal. The gates are parallel to runway 16 right, 34 left.
Yeah.
And also the Qantas jet base was going to be probably removed, an expansion of T3, is it?
Yeah, it will be T3, yeah.
Are they still in train, or is that still on the plan?
All that will get reviewed. Our next master plan, we will start preparing probably late next year, early 23, and it'll depend on the forecast. But you're correct, T1 was going to be extended, what's called Pier A in T1, to the north towards Airport Drive. In fact, just before COVID hit, we were about to publicly exhibit a proposal to do exactly that, to create 4 new gates down there. When demand fell off a cliff, that got deferred. So there'll be a decision on that taken in the context of that next master plan. On the other side, as you say, there was back in 2011, actually, we announced a long-term plan to also operate international from that side of the airport as well. So T2, T3 would not just be domestic, it would be an international terminal as well. Again, all that gets reconsidered in the context of the next master plan. It's got all sorts of benefits. For instance, you can imagine an airline like Qantas, it would be great for them to operate their international domestic services from the one precinct, and Virgin Australia, of course, the same. Secondly, it balances the airfield. About 2/3 of all activity occurs on the domestic side, 1/3 on international. Kind of unbalanced, so you can get queuing on taxiways and the like. Even the road network gets congested more on one side of the airport than the other. So we can balance international domestic better across the airfield. It increases efficiency quite substantially. But as I said, all that will get considered in the next master plan cycle.
In the early days, when the old FAC was basically dissolved and Sydney Airport Limited was set up, there were like 3 companies. There was Bankstown Airport Limited, the old Hoxton Park and Camden. Does Sydney Airport still have any holding interests in those 2 airports?
No. As you said, when it was set up, Sydney Airport Corporation Limited, it was actually Sydney Airports, plural, Corporation Limited, for that reason. That the holding company also ran Camden, Hoxton Park and Bankstown. When the airport was leased, privatised in 2002, it was just the Kingsford Smith site that was leased, and the others were leased to, well, what became, I think Hoxton Park's closed down, hasn't it?
Oh, long time ago.
Yeah. So it's just Bankstown and Camden are the same company, and we're separate. There are all sorts of rules about cross ownership of airports. We couldn't buy Melbourne Airport, for instance, for obvious reasons.
Several minutes ago, mention was made of this book, of which I have my copy, From Bullocks to Boeings.
Oh, yeah. That's from that. There's the book, yeah.
That's it, yeah.
It's an excellent book.
86. Are there any more questions for Ted before perhaps we sign off for the evening?
Just a quick comment. I'll put a link to that little video in the chat.
Oh, excellent.
And Doug Fawcett's book, Pilots and Propellers, is really good on the 1930s history of it, when he was the young kid flogging sweets around the place to all the people coming. But thank you, Ted. That was a fabulous talk, and it brought back a lot of memories and
yes,
filled in a lot of gaps.
That was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. We'll get out to Sydney Airport another day and start travelling.
Yes, hopefully, yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. I'm going to sign off. Thanks for everyone, and Ted, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ted. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Stay safe.